Welcome back everyone. In this video we will see why Jesus cursed the fig tree. The account of Jesus cursing the barren fig tree is recorded in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. Mark 11:12-14. Now the next day when they had come out from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing from afar a fig tree having leaves, he went to see if perhaps he would find something on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. In response, Jesus said to it, "Let no one eat fruit from you ever again." Mark 11:20-24. Now in the morning as they passed by, they saw the fig tree dried up from the roots. And Peter, remembering, said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered away." So Jesus answered and said to them, "Have faith in God. For assuredly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, 'Be removed and be cast into the sea,' and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that those things he says will be done, he will have whatever he says. Therefore I say to you, whatever things you ask when you pray, believe that you receive them, and you will have them." In both the Gospel accounts, the critical relevance of this significant event, with a very profound message, though immediately not apparent, is closely related with the other events taking place at that time. The event of the fig tree cursing takes place during the week before Jesus' crucifixion, after Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem amid exultation from people gathered for Passover, who were looking to him as the Messiah King, who was going to deliver them from Roman occupation. The next day, Jesus travels from Bethany to Jerusalem and is hungry. He sees a fig tree in leaf in the distance, but on inspection finds no fruit and curses it in disappointment, making it wither from the roots, never to yield fruit again. Skeptics' conclusion regarding this seemingly peculiar incident lacks understanding and thus is quite misdirected as to what was involved near the end of Jesus' ministry, as it seemed stunningly out of character for Jesus, but there are very important learning outcomes. Like all scripture, the key to understanding this passage comes from understanding the context in which it happened. On the surface, it is an object lesson on the power of faithful prayer, as seen in Matthew 21:20-22 and Mark 11:20-24. But in the background, a different kind of parable was being enacted, with a sober warning and two takeaways for Christians. Mark tells us that it was not the season for figs, but the tree's foliage suggested that this tree would have fruit. So why would Jesus curse a fig tree for not having fruit when it is not even in season? To answer this question, Mark wedges the temple narrative into the fig tree story. After his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, Jesus was about to cleanse the temple. Matthew abbreviates and places the event of the cursing and the withering of the fig tree all in one account, and includes it after the account of Jesus cleansing the temple of the money changers. But Mark frames it differently, bookmarking Jesus cleansing the temple with the fig tree incident, to ensure his readers its significance in light of Jesus driving the money changers out of the temple. Mark explains that it actually took place over 2 days, with Jesus cursing the fig tree the first day on the way to cleanse the temple, and the disciples seeing the tree withered on the second day, when they were again going to Jerusalem from Bethany. Mark wants us to understand the significance of the temple cleansing by using the fig tree story. As soon as the temple narrative is over, he wraps up the cursing of the fig tree with the tree being withered from the roots up overnight, to the disciples' amazement, as that would have normally taken several weeks. Also, both Matthew and Mark insert the fig tree episode in their Gospels to focus on Jerusalem, where it all transpired. Mark notes that it was not the season for figs, but the tree was in leaf, indicating an early blooming foliage, a sign that figs should have been on it. The fig fruits generally appear before the leaves, and the green fig fruits blend in with the leaves until they are almost ripe. Thus, to see a leafed fig tree even at an unseasonable time warranted the assumption that there would be fruit on the tree. But this tree oddly had leaves but no fruit, thus serving as a perfect visual aid for an important lesson that Jesus wished to teach. Also, the chronological setting and the understanding of how a fig tree is often used symbolically to represent Israel in the scriptures help in understanding the relevant passages. First, Israel, God's fig tree. In the Old Testament, the people of Israel are sometimes symbolically represented as figs on a fig tree, or a fig tree symbolized Israel that bears no fruit. The presence of a fruitful fig tree was considered to be a symbol of blessing and prosperity for the nation of Israel. Similarly, the death of a fig tree would symbolize judgment and rejection. Scripture tells us that fruitlessness leads to judgment. In the past, the nation of Israel had been separated from the pagans to serve a special role, being designated as God's firstborn, as God's vineyard or a planting or a tree. The first fruits of the harvest belong to God, which help conceptualize Israelites' relationship with God as His own special planting, so they must yield spiritual fruit as His covenant people. However, the people of Israel frequently rebelled against God, lacking fruitfulness, a sign of God's punishment for Israel's rebellion. While there were occasional periods of spiritual revival, Israel gradually degenerated into a wicked nation, its rebellion culminating into Jesus' crucifixion, killing the very Messiah for whom they had waited for centuries. We see that several times the prophets describe God as inspecting Israel for early figs, as a sign of spiritual fruitfulness. But when God finds that there is no first-ripe fruit that his soul desired, he pours out the curse of barrenness, and Israel becomes a rotten fig, as seen in the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles. In the symbolism of the scriptures, a fruitless withered tree was worthy of nothing more than being cut down. However, God promises to one day replant Israel and produce healthy figs from it again. The disciples probably understood that Jesus reenacted Israel's history by cursing the fig tree, the foundational metaphorical fruitfulness of Israel seen in the Old Testament, when its spiritual fruitfulness vividly blooms in the prophetic era. And it is time God's people yield fruit and blessings to the world would come from it. Jesus had just arrived at Jerusalem amid great fanfare and expectations, but then proceeds to cleanse the temple, telling us that he was denouncing Israel's worship of God, finding it a den of robbers, and curses the barren fig tree, telling us the significance as to the spiritual condition of Israel, symbolically denouncing Israel as a nation. In the cleansing of the temple, Jesus quotes Jeremiah 7, where Jeremiah challenges the Israelite view that the temple's sacrificial system covered all their iniquities. Symbolically, the cursed fig tree represented the spiritual deadness of Israel, that while being very religious outwardly, with all the ceremonies and sacrifices, was spiritually barren because of its sins. Leaves but no fruit. Thus, Jesus was pronouncing his coming divine prophetic judgment of Israel and demonstrated his power to carry it out by cleansing the temple and by the enacted metaphor of cursing the fig tree, causing it to wither and die. This event is seen as the curse of the Messiah being put to death and is also viewed as a curse related to Israel's soon destruction as a nation in 70 AD. Second, Christians' own figs or fruits. The fig tree represents Christians' own figs or fruits. The term cursed is used only once in the two gospel accounts of this incident. In the scriptures, a curse was a pronouncement of judgment upon a person or object. On the second day, as Jesus and his disciples passed by the tree on the way to Jerusalem, they noticed that the fig tree was completely dead. Jesus' words were a command and a miracle that caused the tree to die. Jesus' action was not a purposeless act of intemperance, but represented a strong object lesson that the disciples needed to learn, and all Christians too since that time. When the disciples asked Jesus to explain what transpired when he cursed the fig tree, he teaches them about the power of prayer. Though they did not fully grasp, they would soon pioneer the Jesus movement from Israel, extending branches taking Christianity to the whole world by the power of faithful prayer, as seen in and beginning with Acts of the Disciples. The incident also teaches the principle that a Christian must bear spiritual fruits of genuine salvation apart from religious profession and observance. Those who are in Jesus are made new creation, and more than being religious, we are called into an active relationship with God that bears fruit through Jesus Christ. The Old Testament expectation that God's covenant people bear fruit did not wither on the road between Bethany and Jerusalem, but the mandate that God's people bear spiritual fruit has actually intensified in the new era. The expectation of fruitfulness is not limited to Israel. Jesus expects his followers to bear fruit as well. He explains this in one of his final dialogues with the disciples before the crucifixion. Thus, the fig tree cursing is not just about historical Israel, but the concept of fruitful living as God's people is relevant to all times, as followers of Jesus are expected to live a life of faith that is revealed through godly living. God judges fruitlessness and expects that those who have a relationship with Him will bear much fruit. Importantly, the relevant passages not only remind us that a Christian by definition must produce spiritual fruit, but that we must be wary of false pretenses of fruit. The fig tree, like the bustling temple courts during Passover, was putting on a pretense show of bearing figs, symbolizing spiritually fruitless Christians who were outwardly religious, indicating a withered root, resulting in no fruit of holiness and lack of intimacy with God. Thus, by cursing the fig tree, Jesus in a sense denounces unfruitful Christians, and it also symbolizes God's judgment upon those who are unfruitful to God. In conclusion, Jesus' cursing of the fig tree is closely related to the cleansing of the temple and is seen as symbolic of God denouncing Israel as a nation and His judgment, and in many ways His denouncing those who claim Christ but do not actually follow Him. The significant event also teaches us very important lessons of false appearances and hypocrisy and fruitful living. Jesus also links the miracle of the fig tree's destruction to the power of faith and prayer. Skeptics might accuse that Jesus destroyed others' property, but Matthew observes that it was growing by the wayside, and therefore it cannot be established that the tree had an owner. Secondly, according to scholars, it was customary for travelers to pick fruit from roadside trees or from any tree that was not enclosed without any censure. Lastly, Jesus is God and everything belongs to Him, and thus has the sovereign right to use His creation to accomplish higher goals which man, with his limited knowledge, may not perceive at a given moment in time. Galatians 5:22-23. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. Colossians 3:12-14. Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. But above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. Thanks for watching. God bless you all.